It was the last period of the day, and the classroom was a ticking time bomb, the tension crackling in the air. Ms. Carter, the math teacher, slammed a thick textbook onto the desk, her eyes narrowing at the back of the room. "Rachel, solve it. Now." The whole class went silent, but the murmur of curiosity was palpable. All eyes turned to Rachel, the quiet girl sitting in the corner. She never volunteered to answer questions, never seemed to care about schoolwork, never participated in the daily banter. In fact, most of the students had written her off as just another average teenager, always in the shadows. But today, something in Ms. Carter's voice was different. It wasn't a challenge, it was a dare. The equation on the board, a monstrous tangle of numbers and symbols, was something even the top students had avoided. It was meant to be unsolvable in under 20 minutes. Rachel didn't flinch, her eyes wide and calm, scanning the equation for less than a second. And then, with a soft sigh, she stood up. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice so quiet that it barely made it to the back of the room. But it was enough to make Ms. Carter pause, her lips curling into a smug smile. The class held their breath. Something was about to happen. "How can you not see it?" Ms. Carter's voice cracked, louder now, her face twisted in disbelief as the class erupted into chaos. Rachel stood frozen at the blackboard, her pen hovering over the final step of the complex equation. She could feel the weight of every student's gaze, every whisper, and the burning frustration of the teacher behind her. How did this all get so out of hand? Was she about to expose herself for something no one could understand? Or was she about to break in front of them all, crumbling under the weight of a challenge no one expected her to face? Rachel had always been invisible. At least, that's what she'd convinced herself. The shy girl who never spoke up, who never drew attention to herself, and who always kept her head down in class. School was a monotonous blur of textbooks and tests. Nothing extraordinary. She had no dreams of grandeur, no lofty ambitions, just a desire to stay under the radar and get by. But deep down, something in her was different. Her mind raced in ways no one could comprehend, especially not her teachers. They dismissed her as a lazy student, barely passing by, too quiet to care. But it wasn't laziness. It was fear. Fear of being too different. Fear of being exposed as the person she truly was. A genius. Because the last time anyone had paid attention to her abilities, really paid attention, it had shattered everything. Her mother had been proud. Her father? Uneasy. And her peers? Well, they had been frightened. She learned early on that brilliance was a dangerous thing. Too much, and people couldn't handle it. So she chose to hide it. When Ms. Carter challenged her to solve the equation, it wasn't out of the blue. Rachel had been hearing whispers for weeks. Whispers of her supposed laziness. Of how she never tried. Of how she always skimmed by in class with little effort. She'd been quiet about it, but the sneers, the eye rolls, the dismissive glances, it had all been building. And now, Ms. Carter was pushing her. Forcing her. She wasn't just asking a question, she was mocking her. Testing her. Expecting her to fail. Rachel's hands trembled as she stood before the equation. But her mind clicked into focus. No one would ever expect her to finish it in time. No one ever did. They all assumed she was just like the rest. But this time, she wouldn't let them control the narrative. "Do it, Rachel," Ms. Carter taunted from the front of the room, her voice dripping with condescension. "Let's see if you're really as smart as everyone seems to think." Rachel's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel the pressure mounting, the tension rising in the classroom. Her classmates stared at her with a mix of disbelief and curiosity, waiting for her to stumble. To fail. Like they all secretly expected. But Rachel was already beyond the point of caring about their expectations. With swift, fluid movements, she began to write out the solution. Her mind was a storm of numbers and patterns, each step more intricate than the last. The classroom was silent. The only sound, her pen scratching against the board. As she approached the final answer, Ms. Carter's voice broke through, sharp and accusing. "You really think you can solve that?" she snapped, her tone dismissive. Rachel hesitated, only for a moment. Then, she wrote the final answer. It was flawless. A long, pregnant silence followed. The air seemed to hold its breath. And then, Ms. Carter let out a harsh laugh. One filled with disbelief. "You actually think this is right?" she scoffed. "This is a university-level problem. You couldn't possibly." Rachel turned, meeting her teacher's eyes. "Check it. It's correct." For the first time, Ms. Carter's smug smile faltered. She stepped forward, her eyes scanning the equation. The room was still. The entire class was holding their breath. Ms. Carter's face shifted. The shock was too much for her to hide. She looked back at Rachel, her voice strained now, far less confident. I need to check this," she muttered as she pulled out her phone, frantically typing the solution into a calculator. Rachel felt a rush of conflicting emotions. The weight of their gazes felt suffocating. Was this the moment she would finally be exposed? Or was it the moment everything would change? What would they think of her now? Would they understand the truth? But the silence lingered too long. Finally, Ms. Carter's voice broke through the tension. "This is impossible." Rachel's stomach dropped. It wasn't just the equation that was impossible. It was everything that came with the revelation. She had done it. She had shattered the facade of normalcy she'd worked so hard to maintain. Her classmates stared at her now, a mixture of awe and fear on their faces. They had no idea what to make of it. And neither did she. As Rachel walked toward the exit, she saw Ethan, the guy who had been in her math class since freshman year. Always joking around. Always charming. But never taking things seriously. He had always been nice to her, but it was clear he didn't really know who she was. But now, there was a change in the air. His eyes met hers across the courtyard. And instead of the usual dismissive glance, his expression softened. He took a few steps toward her, his voice hesitant but sincere. You really are incredible, Rachel." For a split second, Rachel almost felt like a weight was lifting from her. She was finally seen. Not just as the quiet girl, but as someone capable of something extraordinary. And for once, she didn't feel the need to shrink or apologize for who she was. She wasn't perfect. But she didn't have to hide anymore. Not anymore. Here's the continuation of Rachel's story. Rachel walked home that afternoon feeling different. It wasn't just the whispers that followed her out of the school gates, or the way people had looked at her like she was some kind of anomaly. It was the shift inside her. For years, she had hidden her mind, tucked it away like something shameful. But today, she had let it slip, even if just for a moment. And now, there was no going back. As she turned the corner onto her street, she saw her house, a small, quiet place where she had spent most of her life blending into the background. Her mother's car was in the driveway. Good. Maybe she would understand. Inside, the smell of freshly brewed tea filled the air. Her mother, Susan, was in the kitchen, flipping through a stack of papers. She looked up as Rachel entered, her brows knitting together. "You're home late," Susan said, setting her papers down. "Everything okay?" Rachel hesitated, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. "Something happened at school today." Susan frowned. "What kind of something?" Rachel inhaled deeply. "Ms. Carter put up an equation, one that no one was supposed to be able to solve. But I did." Silence. Susan's fingers tightened around her mug. "You solved it?" Rachel nodded. In front of the whole class. A beat of quiet passed between them. Then Susan exhaled, rubbing her temple. "Oh, Rachel." Rachel's chest tightened. "What?" Her mother's voice was gentle, but laced with worry. You know what happens when people see you for what you are. People don't like things they can't understand. Rachel swallowed. I didn't mean to show off. Ms. Carter was pushing me, and I know, Susan interrupted. But this isn't just about your teacher. It's about the other students. The world isn't kind to people like you. Rachel clenched her jaw. So what? I just keep pretending I'm average? Keep hiding? Susan's gaze softened. I just don't want you to get hurt. Rachel's mind flashed back to middle school. To the kids who had whispered about her. To the ones who had stopped talking to her altogether when they realized she wasn't like them. But this time felt different. This time, she didn't want to hide. I don't know if I can do that anymore, she admitted. Her mother's expression was unreadable. Just, be careful, Rachel. Rachel nodded, even though she wasn't sure if she could promise that anymore. The next day at school, things were different. People didn't just glance past her in the hallways anymore. They stared. Some whispered. Others just kept their distance, as if she were something foreign, something they didn't know how to process. And then there was Ethan. He was waiting for her at her locker. Rachel's heart thudded as she approached. Hey. Ethan grinned, leaning against the locker next to hers. Hey, genius. Rachel rolled her eyes. Don't call me that. What, genius? He smirked. But you kind of are one. Rachel sighed, pulling out her books. I don't want things to be weird. Ethan studied her for a moment. Why would they be weird? She gestured vaguely around them. Because people don't know what to do with me now. They think I'm different. Ethan shrugged. Well, you are different. Rachel tensed. But that's not a bad thing, he added quickly. She looked up at him, searching for any trace of sarcasm. There was none. He actually meant it. For the first time since yesterday, Rachel let out a small breath of relief. Maybe this wouldn't be so bad. Maybe, just maybe, she could finally stop pretending. But as she turned the corner toward her next class, she saw Ms. Carter standing by the doorway, watching her. And Rachel knew this was only the beginning.